What up, nerds? Seth here. Help you level up your fandom. And as you can see, I'm on vacation in Big Bear right now. But you know what that means? It's time to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, of course, obviously. Okay, so this is going to be part 2 of my 3-part recap series to get you guys all caught up so we can get back into the actual story that I'm playing now. Where we left off last was the group was in the mine shaft. They were headed back out towards the rest of the people that they had just rescued in the mining dwelling. And we see a large silhouetted, presumably enemy, just backdropped up against the back of this corridor. The light at the end of the tunnel is his backdrop, so we just see him silhouetted, and that's where we left that session, and that's where we left the recap. So we pick back up right there. The group doesn't really know exactly what this is, but you get the feeling that it's pretty ominous. It seems obvious that it's not a good situation to be in. And as they kind of get a little bit closer, they remember, like, oh, we left that bugbear just there. So when the spell like wore off, he's super angry about what we made him do and the fact that we just passed up on him. So they remember kind of who this guy is, and they start prepping for a pretty gnarly fight. As they get closer to the end of this mine shaft corridor, that bugbear kind of starts moving towards them to meet them in the hallway. So they start moving towards each other, and Albin brings his lights up and kind of make this Fight Club style darkly lit arena room where they end up squaring off. They fight. It's a pretty bare knuckle brawl style of fight, but eventually, as you might expect, the group definitely murders this guy. They kind of get him down on his knees, and John comes in and just murders him with an axe. Like, it was pretty execution style, but it worked out well. And, you know, can't say he didn't know what he was getting into. So the group makes their way back up, finds the mine car at the top of this tunnel, or Amifree hops in the mine car and assumes that she can just be pushed towards the entrance of this mining complex and make their way back out into safety. She hops in, and John just gives it a little push, barely touches the car, and it zooms off down the track near frictionless rails. It just goes. She rides over the trap that was there in the floor, and the entire mine cart and tracks kind of sink down as she goes into this trap, and out of the walls come 2 big blades that zoom right over her head, and she has to duck down into the car and barely escape getting her head cut off by these trap blades. Makes it through that trap, and then towards the entrance of the mining complex there is stop blocks for the mining car, and she's still going the same speed she was when she left because the rails are nearly frictionless, and she slams into these mining blocks and gets sprawled all out in the entryway and takes a little bit of damage, but not a whole lot. She kind of looks around a little bit, doesn't see any more threats, doesn't see anything else. She realizes that the cart is where she wants it to go, so she hops back in and gets a little kick off, zooms down the rails again, ducks underneath the trap again, but before she gets to the other end of the rail track, the other stop block, she shouts at the team members to help slow her down. So John and Albin kind of hop in and slow her down a little bit so that she doesn't take any damage when she smashes into the railing. They all pile in the cart, give it another go, push off, and they narrowly escape getting their heads chopped because Amifree forgot to warn them when they went over the trap, and they slam into the railing in the entryway again and sprawl all out in the entryway, get up, reassess, what they're doing, and they realize that there's a couple of doors in this mining complex that they haven't explored yet. So they go looking around, and in one of these rooms they find a bed that is covered in dried blood. Like, someone was clearly murdered in this bed, but it's dry. They don't really find any other clues about that just yet. They start rummaging around the desk and find a map of the area of the world, actually, with their area kind of circled and some arrows and stuff like that, some markings. And then they also find a note. It says, "To Durtham Caster, seek Andor, revere the Seven." And that's all that's on the note. We're gonna move for some better lighting, because the sun is changing. This is better, a little. Okay, so they find that note, and John kind of remembers, he's like, of his time spent in and around Ardenia, and he remembers, Durtham Caster is a sister city, twin cities, on a cliff face. So one of the higher cities, and one is a lower city. But they are so close together and so tightly packed that on a map, they're one city that everybody just calls Durtham Caster. He remembers that one of them is a dwarven city and the other is a human city, and they're linked somehow. They interchange goods or something. He can't remember exactly how they're linked, but he knows that they are linked together. And that's just about all that he can remember about the cities. They explore the second room, which is locked with a weird fancy lock that they eventually break through. Get into this room, and this one is more of a study. It's got some books, desks, stuff like that, and it also has a balcony that is kind of open to the forest beyond, in the same basic spot as the entranceway to this iron mine, but is highly elevated and kind of off in the side and just kind of hidden away. And on this balcony they find a giant crow's feather, like the length of your arm crow's feather, that is very large and a little bit strange. So Albin sees what he can figure out and remember about this thing, and he remembers that, learns a little bit about the lore of the world and how these different races are created and things like that. He doesn't remember exactly what this is or where it came from, but he does piece together that this is probably that crow being thing that they saw in the tavern. So they think that they're on the trail, on the right hunt. Another sun change. So they decide to head off towards Durtham Caster to see if they can track down these people or see what the Seven is or any of that. They break off towards the woods. As they're making their way around these mountains and towards Durtham Caster, which is on the other side of Corim, which is the nation they are, it's on the other side of these mountains. So they know they're in for a long trek, and they kind of start finding a trail and all that stuff. John breaks off and goes to find some food. He finds a deer, kills it, brings it back in to the group, and they find a clearing to kind of set up and start making camp for the day, or for the night. They skin up the deer, lay some out for jerky and all of that stuff. And as they're sitting there, John and Albin kind of get into a little argument about, how they handled those townsfolk, because Albin is positive that leaving the townsfolk up on this mountain and just, to make their own way, they're definitely dead. Like, they couldn't have done that. Whereas John is convinced that they're fine. Everything's fine. They are perfectly capable of making their own way back home. So they get into a little bit of an argument, and Albin ends up slapping John with some meat, and they scuffle a little bit, but they kind of work it out. Begrudgingly make peace, just as they hear some squirming and squealing from just out of the clearing. Before they know it, in runs 5 or 6 tiny little velociraptors. And then they're like, oh, these things might make really good pets. So they start trying to persuade and win over these velociraptors so that they could have companion pets. It doesn't go well, and Albin gets bit a handful of times trying to win over these velociraptors, and they decide to just give up on the whole thing and fight these things. Maybe there's some good meat in there. So they start fighting them, and they kill a handful of them. A couple of them run away, and there's 1 or 2 left. And Amerfree gets out her staff and is just like, you know what I'm gonna do? And she kind of lines up and just swings it like a golf club and pounds one of these velociraptors like way off into the distance. And the entire group kind of freezes and is like, what just happened? All of the velociraptors that are left see their pal sailing through the air, and they're like, nope, not worth it, and they dip out. So they kind of clear out these velociraptors, but they don't make any friends and they don't have any more meat, so that kind of stinks. But they make camp for the night, wake up in the morning and continue on their trek, making their way towards Durtham Castor. They're more than halfway now. Fairly uneventful day. They don't run into any people, they don't run into any like weird animals or none of that. They just follow the trail and find another clearing as it's starting to darken up and make camp. About halfway through the night, they're awoken because a giant spider rolls into camp just to try to see what the heck is going on. Immediately, they wake up, see a spider, and go, okay, well, this is it, and they just start fighting. They dispatch the spider fairly quickly and fairly uneventfully. Fry up a little bit of the spider meat, eat something, and go right back to bed. Wake up in the morning and make their way towards Durtham Castor. So, about midday the next day, they turn a corner and the path that they're on kind of forks off, and one kind of continues up the mountain and one kind of drops down the rest of the mountain into the valley. And they decide to take the lower path, head around, and they come upon a giant wall kind of butting up against the mountain as they make their way towards it. They see that there's a gate with 2 guards in this wall, and they assume like, oh, that's a good way to get into the city. So they walk up to the guards, and the guards are extremely suspicious of them because they're on the northern end of the city, and everything that's north of them is just forest, and people don't live up there, and like nobody comes in this gate. They're really suspicious, but they eventually persuade the guards to let them in, and they take the guise of just hunters and travelers that kind of got a little bit lost and then ended up on the north side. Nothing too major. So they get into Castor, and their first impression is, man, this city just stinks. It is a city. Tall alleyways, dirty streets. It's clearly like a busy city. So they make their way into a tavern, who is owned by a guy named Theo, who's a street urchin. He explains that he just won this tavern through a game of chance, a dice game called Jushu, which is a real game that I made for this campaign. They completely ignore that and just ask more about the city, more about what is going on here, if Theo knows about the 7 or anything else that they may have found in that note. He doesn't know much about any of that. Being a street urchin, he doesn't really know a lot about the higher level stuff in the city. But he explains that they can find an inn in town nearby, and they can head up to Durtham, which is the dwarven city at the top of the cliff, and they will probably have a better idea of what's going on. They're kind of the luxury aristocratic kind of city, whereas Castor's definitely a shithole, as he explains. So, they thank him, have a pint, all that stuff, and then they dip out and head towards an inn because it's starting to get a little bit late, and they don't want to be stuck in the city after dark with no idea what's going on. So they find an inn, they go in, get a room, stay the night. It's completely uneventful. Get up in the morning and decide to make their way up to Durtham. They head towards the cliff face and find the gatekeeper at the bottom of the cliff, who is selling tickets on the stairs up towards Durtham. So they hop in. It's like 5 silver pieces or something, like way more expensive than they thought it was going to be. But as soon as they get into the little room where the stairs would be, they realize like, oh, it's just a cliff face and there's no stairs. But there's someone in there that says, hey, step on this little block, and they step on the block that he says, which is 2 feet wide, and maybe a foot, or it's like 2 feet long and maybe a foot wide, and they stand on this little block, and it rises up out of the ground and then starts making its way up the side of the cliff face up towards Durthram, and they're just standing on this little stone platform as they shoot up the side of this cliff face. It's magnificent, and they are in awe of the city and all of that stuff. They really enjoy the ride up. So once they land in Durthram, they exit the little stair room and are open to this city. They see lots of magnificent stone buildings and just beautiful architecture, and the streets are laid out well, and it's clean and nice, and like it's a very, very clear juxtaposition to Castor, which was bad. They start exploring a little bit. They go into a tavern, ask barkeep like what's going on, see if he knows anything. He doesn't really know a whole lot, but they end up getting breakfast. They order the eggs because that's pretty much the only thing that they can order right now. And the barkeep brings out a giant egg, like twice the size of an ostrich egg, enough to feed all three of them very easily. And they kind of hesitantly eat this egg. It takes them a little while, and then they leave the tavern and start exploring the city. They go up to City Hall, which they're not allowed into because regular folk just can't waltz into City Hall and talk to the leadership. That they have to have an appointment. So they continue on in the city, and they find like a tourist office, or the tourism office. They go in and they learn some of the history of Durthram and Castor and about the war and peace and how they coexist and all of that. Durthram Castor is essentially like are essentially codependent. So Durthram has a bunch of mines in the mountain that have dried up of all the gemstones, but it still brings out this near magical soil and stuff that they then ship down to Castor. And Castor, being at the bottom, has all of this land, but they need that soil to grow the crops. So Castor grows all of the food for both cities, and Durthram supplies the soil needed to grow all the food. So together they can survive, and that's what ultimately ends the war in their history. Is together they have to work together to survive. Otherwise, neither city will survive. So that's interesting. They learn some history about the sister cities, but they don't really learn a whole lot else. They decide to try and maybe find some work here so that they can spend more time in the city and learn a bit more about what's going on. They go back to the tavern and ask the barkeep if he has any work, and he kind of gives them a once-over and says, yeah, if you guys kind of look like adventurers, and if you're true adventurers, then I definitely have some work for you guys. And they're like, oh, we're true adventurers. And he's like, all right, sure. Leads them into the back dining room area of this tavern, and everything gets, as soon as the barkeep leaves the room, everything gets really cold and silent, and John gets like stuck to a chair, and they can't really figure out what's going on. Everything's like slow and weird, and then it passes. They don't know what that was. They don't know what happened. They don't really know much about anything that just conspired, so they decide to go back into the main bar area and ask see what the heck is going on. But once they get into the front end of the bar, it's empty. There's no one there. They decide to this is a little bit weird. They explore the tavern a little bit and find the barkeep, who's just in the back, like everything's normal. And he says, like, yeah, he has some work, but he'll find you. They decide, oh, the bar's empty, so let's make their way into the street and just see if we can figure out what's going on. Maybe we need to weapon up and get prepared for this job that is apparently going to find them. They decide to go to the blacksmith, and as soon as they walk into the smithy, they see the blacksmith is bound and tied and unconscious next to the desk, and they kind of freak out a little bit. As soon as they take their eyes off the blacksmith, there's a person standing there behind the desk who they didn't see come in. He must have come in when they weren't looking. And then they hear the door shut behind them, so they turn and they see this big, burly, like bouncer style guy behind them. And the guy behind the desk introduces himself as Elhorn. He informs them that he is the leader of the Bearded Sinners, and that is the group with which they are now contracted. He explains that they're looking for a stone for him. He kind of describes a little bit of the shape, and it looks like kind of a cat's head, sort of. And there's like green gemstone eyes, but the stone is extremely important, and they are for sure not to touch it. Do not touch the stone. That's the one thing that he really conveys about this thing. And the group gets it. They kind of are like, oh, that's a little weird. We should probably make note of that. But they ask, where they can find it and all that stuff. And the only information that he offers them is that it's the last place that he remembers hearing about it, and where he thinks that it is inside like a temple that's kind of lost in the woods north of Castor, way in the forest. It's been lost for a long time. And that's about all that he offers them. They decide that they'll take the job. It's worth some good money, and they need to figure out a little bit what's going on. And Elhorn kind of promises them knowledge, and he'll answer some of their questions and things like that. So they take the job. They kind of look amongst themselves, and when they look back, Elhorn is gone. And they check the bouncer at the door, and he's also gone. So they decide to try and wake up the blacksmith, because they do still need some weapons and armor and stuff. They wake him up, and he's just stunned and angry, and kind of explains that he has no idea what's happening, and someone snuck up behind him and all that stuff. He doesn't know anything about it, but they end up buying some weapons from him. John gets a sword and some chainmail, and Alvin gets a bow. And then they're kind of just on their way. They head back out, and the first stop that they think of is back to the tourism office, so that they can figure out, where any information on this temple or the stone that they heard about, or any of that. And they get into the tourism office, and the same lady that was there earlier is still there, kind of recognizes them, and comes back and offers a little bit of help. They ask her if she knows anything about the stone or this temple, and she's very hesitant to really talk about it. The stone, they get the impression that stone has been kind of, a lost treasure that's been wreaking havoc in the city. Like, there's people constantly searching for it, and she's kind of hesitant to talk about it. She doesn't believe it's real, all of that kind of stuff. But they eventually persuade her, and she goes downstairs into the archives and does her looking around. The group is still upstairs, and they're just kind of meandering around the public space in the tourism office, and they see some maps, and they learn a little bit about the surrounding forest, and they kind of get some ideas of, where this thing might be and all of that stuff. The lady comes back upstairs, and she has a couple of books and some notes and stuff, and she explains she couldn't really find anything on the temple, but she has been hearing a lot about thieves guilds in the area, been hunting after this magical stone, and some rumors and some stories and stuff, and she thinks that maybe if they could get in touch with a thieves guild, that they might know more about it, since they're kind of the superstitious lot, and they're the ones that have been kind of looking for it for a while. But she does explain she thinks that the stone, being kind of shaped like a cat, might be related to a Yuan-Ti cult named the Cult of Xanthor, who worships cats. And the group is like into it. They're like, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's worshipping cats. Of course, it would be like their sacred item. That's why he wants it. All this stuff. They kind of fabricate this story around this possible connection. And they decide to head back down into Castor and look for some thieves guilds. They thank the lady, make their way out, make their way back towards the gateway and the stairs back down to Castor. Oddly, on this side, to go back down to Castor, since nobody wants to go to the shithole, it's free. They have to pay five silver pieces to get up here, but you can head back down there anytime you want. It's free. Nobody cares. They get on their little stone blocks, and all three of them are making their way down the cliff face, and Amerfree is kind of looking around, and she's just in awe of this place, and she's so excited and interested in stuff, and she kind of doesn't pay a whole lot of attention and loses her balance on the block and starts to fall. Luckily, John was like he kind of knew that this was going to happen, because Amerfree was just not paying any attention. So he had a good eye on her, and he reached down and grabbed her by the arm just as she fell off. So she almost fell to her death down the side of this cliff, but he grabs her, pulls her up onto his block, where they kind of begin to share this tiny, tiny little block, and they're like barely hanging on to this block, and they make their way back down into Castor. So their first thought, now that they're back in Castor, is they should go see Theo, because Theo was a street urchin before he got his tavern, so he probably knows some thieves guilds and stuff like that. So they head over there. Theo's just excited as heck to see him. They were his first customers. They're his best customers. He loves these guys. So they talk to him a little bit, and he's like, yeah, I know some thieves guilds. And they show him, he kind of leans in and shows them, shows the group a symbol for a thieves guild that he was loosely associated with, and explains kind of how to find them and all of that. Basically, as soon as you see this symbol somewhere on a street or anywhere, as soon as you see it, you find the nearest piece of metal anywhere and knock on it 3 times, and they will make themselves aware of you. So they're like, okay, that's interesting. Make their way out back into the city, and they wander around the city for almost a full day. And it's getting a little bit late, evening time. They've found courtyards and castles and houses and all of that stuff, but they haven't seen this symbol yet. And they decide, as soon as they find this thieves guild, they're going to pretend that they're disciples of this cult, this UNT cult, and Amifree's going to be like this leader that they're following, and she's going to get them into the thieves guild as part of this cult, because the cult worships cats in this thing, and the thieves guild's looking for the stone, so they assume that they're connected, so they're going to play it off as they're part of this cult. So they finally make their way into a courtyard, and they see it's a bunch of alleyways kind of branching off of this courtyard, and they just pick one at random, and like, that one looks seedy and weird and unusual, so they head down this alleyway. And as they are looking down the alleyway, and it looks kind of off, a little bit weird, so they kind of slowly make their way through, and they find there's definitely something weird about this alleyway. They do perception checks and investigation, and they eventually take it slow enough where they get right up next to like this wall. It's very like Looney Tunes style, where there is the rest of the alleyway, like they can see it. It's the street is like leading down, like it's obvious. But if they kind of tilt their head a little bit, like that is not real. It's like a painting of this alleyway. So they get a little bit closer, and they realize that it's actually like a dot painting of the rest of this alleyway that has been made up of these tiny thieves guild symbols. And they're like, oh, this is it. We found it. Amifree quickly runs over to the side of the street and pounds on a gutter 3 times, and this like image mesh kind of bows out, and a face kind of like blobs out of this giant image. So they explain to this face that they're part of this cult, and they really sell it that they're disciples, and Amifree is this like crazy cult leader, and she's here to study with the Thieves Guild and find the stone and all of this stuff. And they eventually kind of let them through. The face kind of decides that, yeah, maybe they are kind of telling the truth. So the face blobs back into the wall, and the wall just separates. And as soon as that facade breaks, they just see like crazy busy. The alleyway is super busy with all people rushing back and forth, and they're all part of this Thieves Guild. The guy who was behind the wall, projecting his face out into the alleyway, grabs them and leads them downstairs towards presumably the leader of this cult. They get down into the basement, like into a cellar underneath the alleyway, and there's just the guy behind a desk, and he explains to them why they're being allowed in here, and how they should be so thankful, and like obviously they're not part of a cult, that like they're terrible actors, and he just wants to know why they're here. So they finally break down, and they tell the guy. They explain why they're actually here and what they're here to do, and he kind of helps them out in definitely like a bro fashion, where he's just like, yeah, we're looking for the stone too. Maybe you guys can, split it, help us out. We'll help you, you help us, kind of thing. And he explains that it's not actually a temple, it's a tomb, and it's called the Tomb of the 14 Princesses. And he explains the history of this place, and how it was a king who had 14 daughters and was just not a good king, abusive and paranoid and all of that. So these princesses and their mother conspire against him, and they're going to they're going to murder the king and take over rule, and there'll be better rulers and all of this stuff. But the king finds out about it and has all 14 of his daughters and his wife put to death. And he buries them in this tomb along with this stone. So the head of the Thieves Guild kind of explains a little bit about where this tomb is, and the group makes their way out that way. It is 2 days walk directly north of the one of the pillar gates on the east side of the city. So they make their way back up top, they thank the guy and leave the Thieves Guild, make their way towards that gate which they found when they explored the city earlier. And John kind of intuits with the sun and a little bit of help, they don't have a compass, exactly where north is. So they stand where they were told and they start making their way directly north outside the city. And that's where we left that session, and that's where we're leaving this roundup. Stay tuned for part 3, where we will cover the Tomb of the 14 Princesses and then the following adventures, which should bring us to present day, currently where we are in the story. And then the D&D videos will get a little bit easier to swallow, not so long, not so long-winded and tough to get through. They'll be better, more fun, a little bit more detailed, just fun stuff like that. Thanks for watching, guys. You've made it to the end of the video. Give me a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of the stuff that I'm making on this channel. Want to follow along with this D&D story or see what's going on. Hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified when this dumb face uploads another video. And I will see you guys next week.